Paragraph 36 is the way in which the fifth director is appointed. You questioned Mr. Campbell extensively and Mr. Lacavera extensively on that. We share the concerns with respect to how the fifth director is appointed. So I'll jump now to GCHC. GCHC, that's where Mr. Lacavera will now be chairman, but Mr. O'Connor will now be vice chairman. I'm not at all clear what it means to be vice chairman. I think it'll be important to examine whether or not vice chairman has any powers or there's any importance to that. There are 7 directors in this lower holding company. Now, Orascom nominates directly 3 of the 7, even though it only has 1/3 of the voting shares. The other 4 directors are nominated by GIHC. The 3 Orascom nominees will clearly vote together on all matters. Contrast this with BCE, where 5 of the 13 directors would have been nominated by 3 separate and distinct non-Canadian investors who wouldn't necessarily vote as a bloc. A key point as well, Commissioners, is that Orascom has as much of a say as AAL, if not more so, in appointing GIHC's 4 nominees to the GCHC board. So you've got Orascom appointing directly 3 and having as much of a say as AAL in the appointment of the other 4. That's control. And I've struggled with why there's this second holding company. First, I thought maybe it's for tax reasons, and I know nothing about tax, so I asked, and I was told superficially, look, if you're going to have an enterprise that's going to create losses, and we heard this morning that Globalive clearly will suffer losses at the beginning, you want as flat an org structure as you can possibly have so you can flow those losses up to a higher entity. So it can't be a tax reason. So I don't understand why they have the second holdco, which is rather unconventional, and I don't think there was a decent answer to the question this morning. I'm beginning to think it was done so as to allow Orascom to completely control the operating company at the bottom of the structure. Because at first, when you look at the board structure of GCHC, the second holding company, it looks benign. You have 4 directors and 3 directors, until you realize, as I said, that Orascom has a direct or indirect say in the appointment of all 7. Then you see what's going on. That allows Orascom to completely control the operating entity, because if you took the second holding company out of the equation and insisted that there would be only one holding company, and at that one holding company level there was a majority of directors appointed by AAL, suddenly Orascom can't exercise control over the appointment of the board. I may be wrong as to why this was done, but that's my suspicion, and there was no other reasonable explanation given this morning. So now I turn to the OPCO, GWMC. It has 7 directors. All are appointed by GCHC, and over which Orascom exercises control, as I said several times now. And Orascom put Mr. Sawiris on this board precisely to provide direct input into OPCO's operations. Now, there are also issues with the board quorum rules. At GCHC, there were 2 co-chairs, but now there's a chair and a vice chair. We submit it's all merely window dressing. What's the purpose of a vice chair? More importantly, the vice chair remains an Orascom nominee. Even more important than that, under the current GCHC quorum rules, a quorum of 5 directors, 2 Orascom nominees and 3 GIHC nominees, could include the vice chair, Mr. O'Connor, but not Mr. Lacavera. In the BCE decision, the Commission didn't allow a non-Canadian to appoint the chair. And in this case, it appears from the governance documents that the board appoints the chair, and this needs to be changed because Orascom has as much of a say in the appointment of all these directors. At GIHC, which is the top holding company, a board quorum can consist of the following 3 members: Mr. Ducharme, Mr. Lacavera, and Mr. Farid, who is an Orascom nominee. Mr. Ducharme holds the swing vote and is associated with Mr. Campbell. Given the influence of Orascom over Mr. Campbell and all other members of the management team, it is yet another factor establishing that Canadian investors do not control the GIHC board, which is the top holding company. We now move to the definition of independent Canadian. In the BCE decision, Commission imposed a definition of independent director to ensure that the independent director is not beholden to any investor. The definition of independent Canadian in the Globalive shareholders agreements includes the requirement that the independent Canadian has no other relationship or characteristic that could reasonably expect it to compromise his or her independence. Globalive suggests that Mr. Campbell's independence is not compromised because his prior relationship with Orascom occurred outside the 2-year limit embedded within the definition. In taking issue with Globalive's definition of independent Canadian, and in asserting more generally that Mr. Campbell will be under the significant influence of Orascom, we are not attacking Mr. Campbell's integrity. Rather, the Globalive management team will inevitably be significantly influenced by Orascom and Mr. Sawiris, given Orascom's position as lender, as control over every facet of the operation, and for the stock option reasons and compensation reasons we have mentioned. For this reason, the standard for assessing independence of directors and the management team should be set very high. In reply comments, Globalive compared this situation to the appointment of CRTC commissioners who have past associations with companies regulated by the CRTC. There is no analogy. The commissioners do not take their instructions from those they regulate, nor are they paid by them. I turn now to shareholder vetoes. In the BCE case, the non-Canadian investors' approval rights were limited to matters of indebtedness, prepayment of debt, acquisitions or sales of assets, and strategic alliances and joint ventures. These were outside the ordinary course. And this is a significant point, commissioners. It's not just the monetary threshold that's important, but it's the nature of the veto that's important. So even if you were to raise the vetoes to the 5% standard, and you didn't carve out operational matters, and those would be significant, I spent half my opening statement discussing them, Orascom would remain in control. I now turn to forced sales, which are an additional cause for concern as the Commission noted this morning. Shareholders typically seek contractual protections in the event they do not wish to continue in business together. These provisions are designed to break deadlocks, ensure smooth transitions of ownership, and provide liquidity to both minority and controlling shareholders. A controlling shareholder typically seeks to prevent a minority shareholder from blocking a sale of the company to a third party by inserting a drag-along provision or by having a call right on the minority shares. A minority shareholder usually seeks to ensure it receives the same price for its shares as the controlling shareholder by inserting a tag-along or by having a put right. Apparently there have been changes here, and we'll need to examine the documents, and we'll come back next week if we have comments. But even with the changes, because Orascom is the controlling investor, it still will have controlling shareholder rights. Orascom has the ability to force AAL to sell its shares if Orascom decides to sell 50% or more of its own shares. Orascom can remain in the business, but force out AAL. It appears that this provision would still remain in the governance agreements. Globalive does not explain why the drag-along rights exist in the hands of the purported minority investor and why the purported majority investor has no such rights. Globalive also fails to explain how these rights do not give Orascom undue influence over AAL. I'll turn now to Standstill and then go straight to my conclusion. Shareholder agreements typically provide that the parties will not exit the business for a certain period of time. The Globalive shareholder agreements contain no such standstill. While apparently AAL no longer has the right to withdraw from the wireless business in the first year, what Globalive didn't say this morning is what will happen to a related veto, which is in the agreements. In the agreements, AAL actually has a veto power over any material changes to the non-wireless business plan. That's the pre-existing business Mr. Lacavera brings to the table. This is unequivocal evidence that AAL does not control the GIHC board. If AAL did control that board, AAL would not need such protection over the pre-existing business it brings to the table. Now, what has happened to this veto? Is it still there? AAL also has the option to sell its shares in year 3 to an eligible purchaser of Orascom selection. This still demonstrates a lack of commitment by the Canadian investor purportedly in control of the wireless business. We are not aware at Bell of any precedent with this type of exit provision for the Canadian investor who claims to be in control. So the conclusion. Globalized structure does not meet the foreign ownership laws, and this cannot be remedied by imposing modifications to the structure as the Commission did in the BCE decision. Unlike the BCE situation, where decisions had not been made by any non-Canadian shareholders, decisions made under Orascom's control cannot be undone. Globalized structure does not compare to that examined in BCE. In the BCE decision, there was never any question that the majority of the financial investment would be in Canadian hands. As such, the Commission focused on governance arrangements and not on the source of funds. In contrast, Orascom will not limit itself to being an owner, but will act as majority equity holder and operator. To allow this structure is to say that our foreign ownership rules permit non-Canadians to own it all. Orascom has supplied 100% or close to 100% of the risk capital. Mr. Sawiris would not have made what he himself this morning called a crazy investment without being satisfied that he is in control. Control is the logical business outcome given the extent of Orascom's investment and involvement. That's why this can't be fixed. If Orascom agrees to any changes you seek to impose, it is because it will be satisfied it remains in control. As the Globalive structure is irretrievably broken, Globalive cannot be permitted to operate as a Canadian carrier. Mr. Chairman, you asked TELUS and Rogers when they appeared, what would they do in your shoes? The answer lies in Industry Canada's own AWS policy framework. Industry Canada contemplated this possibility and provided the way forward. The spectrum is to be forfeited and returned to Industry Canada. The AWS auction framework contemplates license forfeiture in the event a bidder turns out to be ineligible to hold the license. This is what should happen here. Industry Canada would then re-auction the returned spectrum. In the case of the set-aside spectrum purchased by Globalive, that auction could be restricted to new entrants who participated in the 2008 auction, provided they were eligible. If no new eligible entrant steps forward to bid for the set-aside spectrum, Bell Canada is prepared to buy up to 50% of it for up to 50% of the price paid by Globalive. Mr. Intvin laughs. However, I think the reason this is in is we predicted that Mr. Sawiris would come here today and plea for dispensation for the rules on the basis that his significant investments would otherwise be down the drain. And what we're saying in this last paragraph is that need not be the case. There can be an auction, and if at the end of the day no one steps forward, we'll solve part of the problem in making sure that the investment doesn't go down the drain. Thank you for providing us with an opportunity to make these submissions, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Let me take you back to paragraph 17 of your presentation. I don't know what to make of. This is slightly different from the evidence I heard this morning. I heard on the morning this Mr. Lacavera was the one who was going to bid on this on the spectrum when he found Orascom as a partner to put together a credible bid. You here suggest that actually Michael O'Connor, an employee of Orascom, started the process, and then AEL came on board only later on as a Canadian front?
No, Mr. I don't dispute that AEL went out before the auction and sought out some foreign partners and eventually reached an agreement with Orascom. I'm in no position to dispute that testimony. I'm sure it's completely true. The point is that during the auction, it is an employee of Orascom who dictated the auction strategy and who had all the decision-making authority over what to bid, where to bid, when to pull out, and whether or not to stay. And Rogers mentioned the same thing in their testimony. And this is all straight out of the investment agreement.
Okay, thank you. The other business you point out is this outside the ordinary course of business. That's you're absolutely right. That's in the BCE case, the vetoes that we discussed were only for something that's done outside the ordinary business. So if you were to revert this agreement and to put make the veto rights apply only with the outside the ordinary course of business, then the various decisions that you walked us through, like selecting your handset supplier or something, would they be in the ordinary course of business or outside?
I would consider them to be within the ordinary course. The bind we're all in here is that even if you were to impose a change that said, okay, the veto threshold will be increased, and now the vetoes will only apply to out of ordinary course matters, Orascom's cemented its control. It's dictated the technology. It's dictated handset suppliers. In fact, it wants to. We heard that. And it's dictated the brand, dictated the cities in which towers will be built. How does one undo all these decisions that have already been made? But putting that aside for a moment, technically speaking, in the future, for future similar decisions, there would be no veto over those, I would imagine.
Okay, thank you. Len?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. I'm not where you are yet when you state in the last paragraph, Globalive structure is irretrievably broken. I'm a long way from it. But at the same time, there are issues, obviously, and we talked about a lot of them, and we heard from Globalive on a lot of them as well. I want to come back to the three pillars, as I think you called them, and I think Rogers earlier as well had a tripartite reference, and that is equity, debt, and some degree of operating influence as well. Let's start with the debt. The fact that Orascom currently holds that debt is a concern that you've raised, and others have raised it as well. But if that debt gets distributed, I'm assuming you would not have that problem.
And when would that take place? Would it take place before you provided approval? Would it take place at some indeterminate future time? The longer this goes on, the more control there will be. So to say, well, it'll get fixed at some point in time, I don't think is an answer. It appears that it's going to be a struggle to get it fixed at some point in time on top of that.
But if it got fixed, that would alleviate your concern, regardless of who owns that debt?
Well, it wouldn't be regardless of who owned the debt, but if it was...
for the third party outside of Orascom's influence.
Well, you have to look at, are there conversion rights in the debt? Are there what kind of vetoes would the new financing institution have? There's a whole bunch of questions that the Commission would have to explore. So in the abstract, I can't say that it's necessarily would be satisfactory.
But the issue you're suggesting right now is there's 60-odd% of the equity and some number significantly north of that on the debt. But if that debt was held by some other foreign entity or Canadian entity, subject to the concerns of control, obviously, as well, you would have less of a problem.
But if there had been a third party, if there had been third party financing from the outset, we wouldn't be raising this issue today. Assuming that there weren't some nasty provisions in the debt instruments.
Okay. The fact that the equity is in the order of 60-odd%, is that a concern for you?
I think the equity is 100%. For the reasons I stated, using the Commission's own precedent, CanWest, I think you have to give zero value. I don't say in the business sense, obviously, value. Yak is obviously a valuable business. I say in the context of assessing the relative equity positions, the AAL wireline business ought to count for zero. So it's 100% equity for the purposes of assessing foreign ownership in Orascom's hands. Now, if it was truly 65%, I've seen situations with 65%.
Would you not agree that to the extent that Mr. Lacavera has signed a bond that basically puts his ownership of that component in the hands of the enterprise, basically commits his personal wealth in there?
The businesses, for the purposes of the way the Commission and CanWest went about assessing the relative equity positions, that wasn't the factor. The factor is, will those businesses truly be operated as one? And here they clearly won't be. In fact, there are mechanisms to ensure that they're kept separate. It's just an opportunity to say, let's put the wireline business in. We'll say that it's worth 35% of the value of the entire enterprise, and we'll say that the money that Orascom has put in is worth 65. That's all that happened here.
Okay.
But there was an independent valuation, as I understand it, of the wireline business, and then whatever number the independent valuation spit out, it was deemed to be 35% of the overall equity position of the entire structure.
Okay. The chairman raised with you the reference to the ordinary course of business, and you basically, I think I heard you say that towers and network infrastructure would be part of the ordinary course of business. What would you consider to be not in the ordinary course of business?
The items that we indicated, for example, from the BC situation, prepayment of debt, joint ventures, strategic alliances, those kinds of matters.
But anything to do with the day-to-day operations of the wireless infrastructure would not be a concern. Oh, yeah, we did. Okay, so it has been defined already. You're right, Mr. Chairman. Okay. Albeit in the broadcasting sense. Can you remind me what the conditions were on the auction with regard to new entrants being able to sell their holdings in the spectrum that they acquire?
There was a 5-year moratorium on selling spectrum to incumbent carriers.
Anything else? Was it?
That was, I think that was it. Certainly the forfeiture provision was contemplated in the event there was an ineligibility. I believe new entrants are able to dispose of their spectrum to anyone other than incumbents, and there was a 5-year moratorium on selling to incumbents. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but I can't remember all
I
the
just
rules.
want to know what they were, because I need to be reminded. I'm sure our staff can do it as well, but I'm sure you're well aware of it as well.
Well, those are,
Yeah.
that's what I remember. If there's...
Okay. I had one more question. So there was a reference that you made to employees on page 8, where you said that Roscom has a veto on remuneration of employees. Can you expand upon where you found that?
Sure, Ruby, you have it. It wasn't on remuneration of employees per se, but on remuneration calculated by reference to income or profits. Those are the words in the documentation. We'll find it.
It's in Schedule A, Part 2, subparagraph E, which is the material contract provision, which reads, enter into any material contract or arrangement with a value in excess of $5 million, or whereby any person would or might receive remuneration calculated by reference to income or profits of the corporation. And then it goes on.
Does the $5 million kick in for there as well, or is that?
I would read it that where the or is, it's $5 million or where any person. So it's $5 million or if your remuneration is calculated by reference to income or profits.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Vice Chairman, now other elements that relate to employees, I didn't put it in, but for example, extended health and dental insurance contracts for up to 2,300 employees, which is what Globalive projects, would be over $5 million, $10 million. So conceivably there'd be a veto there. I didn't bother putting it in for the sake of brevity, but there's another example where a veto might kick in with respect to employee matters.
Again, as long as it's outside the ordinary course of business, which this would not be if it's employees part of the business.
Well, under the structure currently drafted, it would capture this.
My last question is on page 5 of your submission. You suggest in paragraph 20 that the only additional equity that will be coming in will be through Mr. Suarez, since you're saying AAL is putting in their business and that's what they're putting into this thing. So any additional equity will come from Mr. Suarez. That presupposes that no other Canadian partner or entity would come in and invest in this enterprise.
That's one presupposition. The other one is that Mr. Sawiris would allow another Canadian investor to come in. Given the statements that I quoted at the top of page 6, one has to question whether or not there'd be a willingness to do that. Don't know. Maybe there would be, but one has to question.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
I'm a little perplexed by your comment regarding the fact that this was broken and it can't be fixed because they've already done what you view as bad things. Surely, I'm sure they can speak up for themselves, but it seems hyperbolic to me to say that. So help me understand where you would come from on that, because they had spectrum, which they bought legitimately. They had approvals that were given legitimately to act the way they did. So where are you coming from on that, or are you just using hyperbole to make a point?
No, trying to make a serious point. Take the technology. Particular technology was chosen, and a particular vendor was chosen, Nokia Siemens. perhaps AAL or Globalive actively sought out and chose Nokia Siemens. But in that case, Orascom clearly had a veto, and if they didn't veto, it's because they were satisfied. Or perhaps in this case, it was Orascom who suggested Nokia Siemens, in which case it's Orascom who positively decided that it would be Nokia Siemens. In either event, the technological path that this enterprise is down is fixed. Take the brand. Those decisions have been made. I mean, Orascom has a significant influence over them. We're not going to undo, or Globalive is not going to undo the choice of brand because the commission changes a veto structure or board composition. Okay. That's what I'm trying to say.
So what?
Well, this is the so what. Let me put it another way. Maybe it'll help. Orascom's put in absolutely all the money. Would Mr. Sawiris, as experienced as he is in business affairs, would he put in all the money in a venture as risky as this, and not my words, it's his words, unless he were satisfied that he controlled that investment? Perhaps modifications will be imposed by the commission. It's the typical way things are done, and I wouldn't be surprised if it were done here. What I'm suggesting is, if after deliberating over those changes, Globalive comes back and accepts them, it's because Orascom is satisfied that it remains in control, even with the changes that the commission has imposed.
So the only decision we can make is to basically shut them down. That's your position?
Orascom and Globalive pursued this venture knowing from the very beginning that there was an eligibility issue, and if they turned out to be ineligible, spectrum would be forfeited. The rules aren't being made after the fact.
I just need you to. How do you know that they knew from the very beginning?
Because in the AWS policy framework document issued by Industry Canada before the spectrum auction was commenced, all the rules I'm mentioning, were laid out. Every bidder was told that there would be an Industry Canada review of foreign ownership, as well as a CRTC review of ownership. And if a bidder who won and paid for a license turned out to be ineligible, the license would be forfeited. It's right there in the documents that were issued in 2007. It's page 29 of Industry Canada's licensing framework for the auction for spectrum licenses for AWS and other spectrum. And I quote Commissioner Menzies, in the event, page 29, in the event that a provisional license winner does not, in the opinion of the department, comply with the Canadian ownership and control requirements, the department will require that the provisional license winner make changes in order to become compliant.
That's Industry Canada.
Hold on, but if the provisional winner fails to comply, then the license will be forfeited. And elsewhere it says, and I quoted in my opening statement at paragraph 6, that the licensing regime recognizes the complementary nature and the division of responsibilities among Industry Canada, the CRTC, and the Competition Bureau. And then, in an Industry Canada circular dated August 2007, page 4, section 8, applicants are reminded that the CRTC has its own mandate under the Telecom Act in relation to Canadian ownership and control requirements for Canadian carriers. It was all there from the beginning.
I see. I don't think I have any more questions.